Paranormal happenings, whilst undoubtedly ominous, can be said to have limited material consequences. A whisper in the night causes more mental turmoil than it does physical, just as an intense and yet inexplicable feeling of being watched engenders a greater emotional response than it does bodily. And so, in most instances of the paranormal, the unseen can be described as little more than a paper tiger, all raw and no bite. In this way, it is easy for us to content ourselves with the belief that the dead can do no harm, and yet this is not always true. For in the 1920s, a family living in the great Indian metropolis of Poona reported manifestations of such extreme violence that a little boy was left fearing for his very existence. Strangulation, blood drawn from cuts made by rusty razor blades thrown across rooms, attacks perpetrated by unseen hands, bites, slaps and punches, relentless levitations and teleportations, and even a mother being driven to end her own life, all ascribed to the malicious dead. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. The city of Pune is considered to be one of the most important educational hubs in all of India. Widely regarded as the Oxford of the East, it boasts over 100 educational institutes, including several prestigious universities. As such, the city has long attracted academic interest, not just domestically, but internationally, with intellectuals from all over the world having moved to the city throughout its history. In the opening decades of the 20th century, when Pune, or Poona as it was then known, was under British rule, two German ladies settled in the city so as to pursue their academic work. One, Miss H. Cohn, held an official post as teacher of European languages for Poona's prestigious Deccan College. The other, her sister, was an accomplished translator, having produced English and German translations of several well-regarded academic texts, including the history of Indian literature. She herself was married to another scholar, Dr. S. V. Ketkar, a highly regarded Brahmin historian and encyclopedist. And so we meet our cast of characters, sober intellectuals who can be said to be intrinsically at odds with all that is paranormal. And yet it was under their roof that the incomprehensible is claimed to have occurred, with Miss Cohn taking it upon herself to record all that happened from July 1928 to July 1929. Her diary, admirable for its precision and horrifying for the mundane manner in which it documents the happenings, which are anything but mundane, provides an extraordinary window into events which can only be described as terrifying. At the phenomena's centre was Damodar, the 10-year-old adopted son of Mrs. and Dr. Ketkar. Described as a jolly and intelligent child, he had been welcomed into the family not long after his 4th birthday, in May 1923. For many years he lived with the Ketkars and Miss Cohn without incident. To all who knew him, he was a happy and normal little boy. And yet, all of this changed in the summer of 1927, when Damodar's older brother, a then 15-year-old called Ramkrishna Bapat, came to live with the family. The teenage boy, an orphan the same as his brother, had been working at a tea shop in the neighbouring city of Mumbai when Dr. Ketkar intervened. Overworked and exploited, Ramkrishna was malnourished and living in poor conditions, and so the doctor arranged for him to be put under the care of a Mumbai clerk in his employ, with whom he would work whilst also attending school. This arrangement was successful for the first year. However, very soon into the second, it became obvious that there was a problem. The first day of school of the second year, the boy reported that, as he was walking along with his satchel, he felt himself transported to Victoria Gardens, minus the satchel. At first, the family paid no great attention to these tales, and yet, as they increased in regularity, with the boy claiming to have been teleported again, it became more and more difficult for them to be dismissed. All the more so when the clerk who was caring for Ramkrishna asked for him to be removed, as daily supernormal things were happening. Objects in the office were removed noisily from their places. Tricks were played with water pots and milk vessels, until it reached the point that both the clerk and his assistant felt too nervous to keep the boy there. Thus, left with little other option, the doctor invited him to come and stay with him, his wife, his son, and his sister-in-law in Poona. Describing these early days, Miss Cohn explained how she, her sister, and her brother-in-law fully believed we should be able to ascertain that the alleged phenomena were merely illusions on the part of credulous, superstitious people. In particular, they thought that the seemingly supernatural happenings might simply be a case of sleepwalking. And so she and her sister took turns to watch the teenage boy as he slept once he moved into the house. It did not take her long to realize just how wrong they were. One night in August 1927, when observing Ramkrishna at night, Cohn claimed to have suddenly seen a mirror some 16 inches in length descend from the wall and stand gently on the floor. It did not fall, the string upon which it hung not having been torn, but instead appeared to have been deliberately detached from its nail, which remained firmly in the wall, by some invisible being. Throughout the incident, the teenage boy slept heavily. On another occasion, when Ramkrishna was resting, she alleged to have witnessed a different object, this time a heavy glass paperweight, descend in a similarly gentle way from the table upon which it lived. Most horrendous, however, was how she reported the household being awoken one evening by a tremendous bang. When they rushed to investigate, they are said to have found the heavy wooden trestle table upon which the boy had been sleeping moved out into the room at an angle 45 degrees. In the course of its movement, Ramkrishna had been violently thrown from it. Moreover, the whole room was in the utmost disorder. A small trunk was standing blocking the door at the opposite end of the room. Books and other articles were scattered here and there, and the chairs were all in different positions. Terrified, Ramkrishna refused to return to the table, and slept on the floor for the remainder of the night. And so the boy wasn't responsible. Not merely did he suffer the consequences of the happenings, thus lessening the likelihood of him being their originator, they were witnessed by several others in the house, and eventually others in the city too. For during the latter part of 1927, as stories of the elder boy's experiences spread, people offered to let him sleep in their houses. As Cohn wrote, invariably, however, they were only too pleased to let him go away again after a few nights, as members of the family grew nervous, owing to mischief being played on their water and milk vessels. As certainly, according to her written reports, much of the early phenomena centered on the movement of objects, with poltergeist-like happenings ranging from personal possessions disappearing and later mysteriously relocating, to coins falling in broad daylight out of thin air, becoming commonplace occurrences within the house. Then, in the opening months of 1928, the activity changed. Having once followed Ramkrishna around the house, around the city, and all the way from Mumbai, in fact, it now began to follow his younger brother, Damodar. Miss Cohn reported that it started with the little boy's toys. She wrote how one day my nephew's ball came rolling along the floor of the veranda while we were at breakfast and gave me a hard knock on the ankle. Later, in early April, another of Damodar's toys is said to have flew from the cupboard past her sister and the little boy with such great force that it travelled through into another room. As can be imagined, both Damodar and his adoptive mother were petrified. And yet the worst was still to come. The very next day, the activity escalated, with the unseen force responsible and seemingly attached to the Bapat brothers targeting Damodar to such an extreme degree that he was prevented from sleeping, eating, and even drinking for several days. For whenever the little boy tried to eat, his food would be repeatedly snatched from his hand, and his drink from his mouth, though he made frantic attempts to retain his hold of these things. Then, whenever he moved about the house, he would be chased, so it appeared, by an attacking force, from room to room, with objects, most especially his own toys, being hurled from all directions, thrown in such rapid succession and with such fury that Damodar and his adoptive mother felt absolutely paralysed with fright. In an attempt to protect him, his parents began to feed him by hand, with Dr. Ketkar holding the phenomena-ridden boy in his lap so as to shield him from the objects which are said to have continued to have been thrown. All this did little to lessen the happenings. Horrifyingly, to the minds of those in the house, it looked like a determined effort aimed at the child's life. And indeed, as time went by, it was whispered that this was not the first time the unseen force responsible had driven someone to death. Reflecting upon the boy's origins, it was feared that the reason why Damodar had been made an orphan in the first place may have been something to do with the paranormal activity. According to what Miss Cohn was able to uncover, not merely had Ramkrishna been troubled by spirits on and off since early childhood, but his and Damodar's mother also. Sharing some of the details, she reported that the mother had become very depressed, owing to apparitions which she is said to have seen on the stairs of their house. These apparitions were visible to no one else, but the woman insisted that she saw them. She would refuse to enter the family home and became increasingly disturbed until she finally ended her life by pouring kerosene on her sari and setting fire to it. Tragically, the family also had another son, an older boy, who died at the age of 9. And so it was thought that Ramkrishna and now his younger brother Damodar had inherited the same supernatural affliction suffered by their mother. Such a fear seemed in some way to be confirmed when, on the 12th of August 1928, Damodar's adoptive mother reported seeing not one but 2 apparitions. Similar to her predecessor's experiences, she was the only one to witness the occurrence, with her sister and Damodar having already gone to sleep. As they slept, so Mrs. Ketkar claimed, a faint outline of 2 white figures appeared to come from the wall beyond her sister's bed. Filmy and indistinct, the shapes were still clear enough to be identifiable as figures, and they came towards her sister's bed, moving as though making her bed. Scared, she could only watch as the spectres crossed the room. It was only a matter of time before Damodar too reported seeing and hearing apparitions. Describing them as horrible faces, they even followed him to school, grinning at him, whispering to him, plaguing him from the moment he awoke to the moment he fell asleep. As for everyone else in the house, they continued to suffer the regular movement of objects, most especially the appearance and disappearance of coins, and the breaking of glass and the spilling of ink, with Miss Cohn's diary of events treating such happenings as they became more and more regular as increasingly normal, if troublesome. Even so, the entity responsible, whoever or whatever it was not content to leave the torment there. As 1928 progressed, so did the paranormal activity. Damodar reported feeling hard pushes on his back and shoulders and would enter states of lethargy and depression as he, for entire days at a time, suffered the unseen hands. Then came the regular levitations. Running into the house from the compound, the boy is said to have cried to his adoptive mother that he had felt himself lifted from the compound into the motorcar which stands in the shed. His eyes had been closed in fear. When he had opened them, he found himself on the front seat of the car, the door to the shed closed. Miss Cohn's sister reported that the boy had scarcely been able to speak so as to tell her this, with him looking dreadfully pale and frightened. He was in such a state, in fact, that a doctor had to be called to the house. According to Cohn's diary, his pulse was almost gone, and his eyes were rolling. He was unable to eat for several days, and was quite thin and weak. And so the phenomena were becoming increasingly dangerous. Worried for their son, Dr. and Mrs. Ketkar sought the opinion and advice of medical doctors, with them reporting that their child was completely physically exhausted. There was, however, no clear reason for this, with the boy being otherwise healthy except for a small problem with his eyes. And so all the local medical men were convinced of the abnormality of the happenings, with no cure being offered. It was at this point that the Ketkars sought other forms of help, including from a clairvoyant and a stranger who had read the reports of the case in the local newspaper and came to the house confident that he had power to drive out these spirits. And yet, when he did, reciting mantras meant to alleviate the manifestations, the activity only worsened, with a cup being most violently hurled, shivering into innumerable fragments before all those present. According to Miss Cohn, the spirits reacted strongly to any serious attempt of an exorcist to interfere with them. On the 13th of August, the same stranger, referred to as Mr. V by Cohn, became entranced during another attempt at exorcism. Seemingly possessed, he is said to have then fallen unconscious for several minutes and was only able to be revived by having water poured all over him. By December of that year, the phenomena, unhindered, unstopped, was violent and persistent. Terrifyingly physical, whatever resided in the house continued to attack Damodar. Food is also said to have been regularly stolen from the cupboards of the house, seemingly manifesting through closed doors and thrown at walls and people, with eggs being the favourite foodstuff to be destroyed. Certainly, the family so expected these happenings that they took to leaving their eggs with a neighbour so as to safeguard them against the entity. More bizarrely, it was even reported that, far from simply wrecking the food, the unseen entity would eat it too. According to Cohn, fruit was often taken and eaten, with the invisible ones, as she called them, flinging back the skins, scraped clean, and with teeth marks clearly visible on them. This was allegedly witnessed by many, and on many occasions, with her sister and brother-in-law even claiming that they heard the feet of the spirits and also the smacking of their lips as they consumed the fruit. Another time, 6 eggs went missing, with Mrs. Ketkar later finding them stuffed in the small space between the gramophone case and the wall, their insides sucked clean from their shells. That winter, further attempts at exorcism were made, involving both local witch doctors and Christian clergymen. Despite settling the activity for 2 days in the case of the latter, they ultimately did little to help. And so the Ketkar household saw in the new year with yet more paranormal activity. Whenever the older boy Ramkrishna visited, he now having moved out of the home, the activity worsened. Clearly, whatever was happening was focused on the brothers and had no intention of stopping. In April 1929, there is said to have been a sinister new development in the case. Writing of a letter which her sister sent to her while she was away from the house, Miss Cohn described how Damodar's hand had been bitten. Blobs and streaks of thick, bubbly saliva were found on his skin, and later also on the necks and legs of his adoptive parents. They, so the letter detailed, were also scratched and pinched by some unseen entity. The violence, horrifically, then spread to include Damodar's little sister, a baby girl having been welcomed into the family at some point in the past year. She too was pinched and scratched. The most terrible incident, however, took place on the 28th of April. According to Miss Cohn, at supper my sister asked Damodar to tie the little girl's bib on for her, which he did. She fidgeted, so he only got 1 bow and 2 ends, instead of 2 ends and 2 bows. About 3/4 of the way through the meal, she suddenly grabbed at her own neck in distress. My sister rushed at her to find the bib drawn up tightly around her throat and knotted at the back of the neck with a chain of 6 knots in the tapes. It seems that whatever unseen force had done this had been intent on strangling the girl. That month, all manner of violent reports came from the Ketkar household, from further instances of being scratched and smacked hard on the back, to the little girl's thumb being suddenly cut and blood drawn, to Damodar's shirt and vest being audibly cut and torn while on his body, to an old rusty razor blade being thrown across the room, slightly cutting Damodar's legs. After the attempted strangulation of the little girl, in a state of desperation, the parents once again allowed for an exorcism to take place in the house. A regular prayer meeting was held, things were thrown during the meeting, there was subsequent peace. Afterwards, throughout May and June, there is said to have been comparative peace, before the activities started up again in July. Working with clairvoyants, local spiritualists and witch doctors, the family were able to piece together various theories as to why Damodar was suffering. One potential explanation was that he and Ramkrishna, and quite possibly their mother before them, were being haunted by the spirit of their older brother, who had died at the age of 9. Another idea involved a vengeful work colleague of their long-dead father, who, it was suggested, may have employed a sorcerer to do harm to the boy's father and his family, through the medium of spirits under the sorcerer's control. When the father died, the boys inherited the curse. In this case, the only way to end the evil would be for the father's line to die out. And so there was no end in sight for the family. In the end, Miss Cohn could do little more than document all that took place, until, by chance, she stumbled across the strange phenomena said to have surrounded a young girl from Romania by the name of Eleonora Zugun. Introduced to an article about Zugun by one of the Jesuit fathers with whom she worked, Cohn was struck by the similarities between her case and all that she had experienced and observed with her nephew. In particular, she was surprised to read about the claims of near-constant apports, most especially the curious appearances and disappearances of coins and notes, as well as the movements of furniture, the alleged consumption of food by spirits, and even the appearance of spittle-covered bites and wounds on the body of the girl. The coincidences were too much to ignore, and so inspired, Miss Cohn wrote a letter to a man with a strong connection to the Zugun case, the prominent British psychical researcher Harry Price. It is in large part thanks to Price and his meetings with Miss Cohn, who travelled to London so as to be able to place her reports in his hands, that we know of this case. When he met with her, he was greatly impressed, describing her as a highly credible witness, as well as remarking that the quality of her notes about the manifestations put some experienced investigators to shame. As for Miss Cohn herself, when addressing the issue of credibility, she was very much of the opinion that it was physically impossible for the boy to have produced all the phenomena himself, as many occurred when the lad was asleep and watched by several persons. She also stated that she took especial care to avoid the slightest exaggeration or inaccuracy, with the events always recorded immediately after their occurrence. Others too came forward to provide further corroboration, including a Mr. J.D. Jenkins, who wrote to the London weekly journal The Spectator in 1934 to explain how he had investigated the Poona case a few years earlier. A medical man, Jenkins explained how he had visited the Ketkar household, being a friend of the doctor, and was able to examine Damodar so as to confirm that he was neither ill nor faking the activity. Whilst there, Jenkins was allegedly able to observe a bottle of ink that was on the table by the window be flung towards him. He also wrote that the glass paperweight narrowly missed his head. By the end of his experience, he was astounded and could provide no explanation as to the events. In his own words, "I found that malobservation, illusion, etc. could not, as I had previously suggested, account for all of this." Despite being invited by Harry Price to bring the boy to England and his London laboratory for further study, Miss Cohn and the Ketkars seemed to drop off the radar soon after that. Their story, and in particular Cohn's extensive notes, appeared in multiple publications of the time. It was hoped, as Price made clear in his writings about the happenings, that the activity would dwindle as Damodar grew older and reached puberty, much the same as had happened with Eleonora Zugun. Whether or not this was the case, we do not know. We are simply left with his postscript, which appeared in the May 1930 issue of the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research. At the date, October 8, 1929, of forwarding this article to America, the phenomena are still happening with the old fury. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do leave a like and subscribe for more of the paranormal. And if you cannot wait until my next video, why not watch the one suggested on screen now? Until next time,